For 6 years, the world taught Kate Smith that she and her daughter were nothing more than invisible ghosts haunting the fringes of a city of millions, until she sat in the oppressive shadow of a man who looked at the fresh bruises on her face and decided that what the world had broken, he would make his own. The terminal station was a cavern of damp, recycled air and flickering fluorescent light that hummed with a low, electrical anxiety. Outside, the midnight rain lashed against the grime-streaked glass, but inside, the silence was even heavier. Kate huddled into her thin, worn jacket, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a handbag that contained her entire life. Beside her, little Ashley sat with a heartbreaking stillness, her small, trembling hands clutching a lopsided teddy bear as if the toy were the only thing keeping her from drifting away into the dark. They sat on the very edge of the cold plastic bench, trying to take up as little space as humanly possible, practicing the art of being unseen that had become their only means of survival. The reflection in the darkened terminal window showed a woman Kate barely recognized, exhausted, pale, and physically shattered. A dark purple bruise bloomed across her cheek like a macabre flower, and her lip was split where the past had finally caught up to her. Every time the heavy station doors hissed open, Kate's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. She could still feel the phantom heat of the rage she had fled, the terrifying certainty her abuser had instilled in her, that because she was an orphan with no foundation, she was a speck that could be erased without a ripple. Her dark, unkempt hair fell in messy strands, shielding eyes wide with a hypervigilance that had become her soul's only armor. She watched the commuters hurry past, ordinary people with homes and names, who glanced at Ashley's tear-filled eyes with fleeting pity before turning their heads away, unwilling to engage with a tragedy they didn't understand. Then, the air in the terminal suddenly shifted. The ambient noise of the city died, replaced by a cold, controlled pressure that made the hair on the back of Kate's neck stand up. A subtle scent of expensive cedar and something sharper, like cold ozone, drifted over them. Kate finally forced herself to glance sideways, and the breath caught in her throat. Sitting directly beside them was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of obsidian. Seo Kang-jun sat with a stillness that was predatory, his sharp East Asian features set in an unreadable mask of high-status discipline. He wore a black tailored suit that looked like armor, his white shirt open just enough to hint at the dragon ink snaking up his neck. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking away. His focused, lethal eyes were tracking the terminal doors, occupying the space with a quiet dominance that signaled a terrifying truth: the world had ignored her tears, but the man who owned the city's shadows had just found his new empire. The midnight rain did not just fall against the glass of the terminal station, it attacked it, a rhythmic, percussive onslaught that sounded like 1,000 small stones being cast against a sanctuary that offered no real protection. Inside, the air was a stagnant soup of recycled heat, industrial floor wax, and the low-frequency hum of flickering fluorescent lights that seemed to vibrate in time with the anxiety rattling Kate Smith's ribcage. She sat on the very edge of a cold, blue plastic bench, her body coiled like a spring that had been wound past its breaking point. Every time the heavy pneumatic doors at the far end of the hall hissed open, a draft of freezing Chicago air swept through the terminal, carrying with it the scent of wet asphalt and the terrifying possibility that the shadow she had spent 6 years trying to outrun had finally materialized in the doorway. Kate's fingers were white-knuckled, their grip so tight around the faux leather handle of her handbag that the circulation had begun to die in her tips. That bag held their entire world, 2 birth certificates, a handful of crumpled 20s, and the desperate, fragile hope that a bus ticket could buy a new soul. Beside her, little Ashley was a small, slumped monument to a childhood interrupted. The girl was 7 years old, but in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights, she looked ancient, her features pulled tight by a precocious understanding of fear. She was huddled into a soft pink hoodie, the fabric a jarring, innocent contrast to the grime of the transit hub. Ashley wasn't looking at the few other travelers scattered across the waiting area. Her entire universe had shrunk to the size of the tattered teddy bear she held crushed against her chest. The bear's fur was matted and one of its button eyes was loose, hanging by a single silver thread, but to Ashley, it was the only anchor in a world that had suddenly turned into a storm. She didn't cry out loud anymore, the time for loud tantrums had ended years ago, replaced by a silent, glossy-eyed weeping that was far more heartbreaking. A single tear traced a path through the faint dust on her cheek, disappearing into the collar of her hoodie, but she remained perfectly still, a well-trained ghost in a city that preferred its victims to stay invisible. Kate shifted slightly, and the movement sent a sharp, hot spike of pain radiating from her left cheekbone down into her jaw. She didn't need a mirror to know what she looked like. She had caught her reflection in the darkened terminal window moments ago, and the image had stayed burned into her retinas. A dark purple bruise, the color of a late autumn storm cloud, bloomed across her temple and cheek, the swelling making her left eye appear sunken and haunted. Her lip was split, a jagged red reminder of the final lesson her past had tried to teach her before she bolted out the door. Her dark, shoulder-length hair was a tangled mess, damp from the sprint through the parking lot and matted with the sweat of pure, unadulterated terror. She tucked a loose strand behind her ear, her hand trembling so violently she had to shove it back into her lap. She felt like a hollowed-out shell, a woman made of ash and adrenaline, waiting for the first strong wind to blow her into nothingness. The other passengers in the terminal were ordinary people, commuters whose biggest worries were late arrivals or missed connections. They sat with their newspapers and their glowing phone screens, cocoons of normalcy in a place that felt like purgatory to Kate. Occasionally, someone would look up and catch sight of the bruised woman and the crying child. Kate would see the flicker of recognition in their eyes, the momentary flash of pity that would almost instantly be replaced by a cold, deliberate turning of the head. It was the orphan complex that had been drilled into her for over half a decade, the terrifying, absolute certainty that because she had no parents to call, no siblings to shield her, and no foundation to stand on, she was essentially a non-person. She was a speck in the vast, grinding machinery of the city, and the commuters knew it. To help her was to invite the chaos of her life into theirs, and in a city of millions, silence was the most common form of currency. Kate felt the weight of their collective indifference pressing down on her, a physical force that made her want to curl into a ball and disappear into the cracks of the linoleum floor. "Mama," Ashley whispered, her voice so thin it was almost lost to the hum of the ventilation system. "Is he coming?" Kate didn't answer immediately because the lie felt too heavy to speak. She reached out and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, feeling the way the small girl flinched before realizing it was her mother's touch. The tension in Ashley's frame was an indictment of everything Kate had failed to protect her from. For 6 years, the girl had watched her mother become smaller and smaller, a disappearing act performed in the shadows of a home that had become a cage. Now, in the middle of a transit terminal at midnight, the cage had simply expanded to the size of the city. Kate squeezed her daughter's shoulder, her thumb tracing the soft fabric of the pink hoodie. She wanted to tell her that they were safe, that the bus would come and take them to a place where the sun always shone and no one ever raised a hand in anger. But the truth was a jagged thing, they were two lost souls with no destination, running on nothing but the desperate instinct to survive one more hour. The rain outside intensified, a sudden roar that drowned out the distant sound of traffic. Kate looked at her luxury brand watch, a gift from the very man she was running from, a golden shackle that she hadn't yet been able to bring herself to discard. It was nearly 12:15. The bus was late. Every minute that passed felt like a door closing, a tightening of the noose. She imagined her past moving through the streets like a predator, scenting the air for her fear, navigating the grid with the absolute certainty of a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere else to go. She felt the hypervigilance humming in her teeth, a high-pitched frequency that made every shadow look like a threat and every footstep sound like an executioner's approach. She was an orphan, a runaway, a woman who had been told she was nothing so many times that she had started to believe it was her name. But as she sat there, clutching her handbag and shielding her daughter, the atmosphere in the terminal began to undergo a subtle, terrifying transformation. It wasn't a sudden noise or a shift in the light, it was a change in the air pressure, a heavy, cold stillness that seemed to radiate from the far side of the waiting area. The commuters, usually so focused on their own worlds, began to grow quiet, their eyes darting toward a figure that had just occupied the seat directly to Kate's right. Kate felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up, a primal instinct warning her that a new kind of power had just entered her orbit. It wasn't the chaotic, petty rage she was used to. This was something disciplined, ancient, and absolute. She didn't want to look. She wanted to keep her eyes on the bus schedule, to stay invisible in the flickering light. But the presence beside her was impossible to ignore. It carried the scent of expensive cedarwood, hand-rolled tobacco, and a sharp, metallic edge that smelled like a winter sky just before a blizzard. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Kate turned her head. Sitting less than 3 feet away was a man who looked as though he had been carved out of volcanic rock. He was East Asian, his features sharp and impeccably defined, a jawline that could have been etched with a scalpel. He wore a black tailored suit that fit him like armor, the fabric so dark it seemed to absorb the sickly yellow light of the terminal. His white shirt was crisp, the collar slightly open to reveal the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo that snaked up his neck, a dragon's tail, vanishing into the neatly styled black hair at the base of his skull. He wasn't looking at a phone. He wasn't looking at a newspaper. He was sitting with his legs slightly spread, his hands resting on his knees with a calm, predatory grace that made the plastic bench look like a throne. His eyes were the color of flint, narrowed and focused, tracking the terminal doors with an intensity that made Kate's heart stop. He didn't look like a traveler. He looked like the man who owned the shadows the travelers were trying to avoid. For the first time in 6 years, Kate Smith felt someone looking not at her bruises, but at the person hidden behind them. The mafia boss didn't offer a word or a smile, he simply sat there, a pillar of lethal silence in the storm, and Kate realized with a jolt of pure electricity that the world had finally stopped ignoring her tears. A different kind of fire had just arrived, and the terminal of lost souls was about to become a battleground. The arrival of the man in the charcoal black suit was not a loud event, yet it possessed a gravity that seemed to pull the very oxygen out of the terminal. In the chaotic, shifting landscape of the transit hub, a place defined by the frantic shuffling of feet and the desperate, wet cough of the city's forgotten, Seo Kang-jun was an impossible island of stillness. He sat with a terrifying, absolute composure, his back straight against the cheap blue plastic of the bench, his presence transforming the utilitarian furniture into something that felt like a seat of judgment. The contrast between him and Kate was so sharp it felt like a physical ache. Where Kate was a blurred charcoal sketch of a woman, frayed at the edges and damp from the Chicago rain, Kang-jun was rendered in high definition, every line of his tailored suit and every hair of his perfectly groomed scalp suggesting a world where chaos was a choice and order was a religion. Kate felt her pulse thrumming in her teeth, a high-pitched vibration of pure, unadulterated terror. She had spent 6 years learning the architecture of a man's rage, the sudden flush of a neck, the twitch of a vein in a temple, the smell of cheap beer and stale sweat. But this man offered none of those markers. He smelled of expensive cedarwood and cold metal, a scent so clean and sharp it made the recycled air of the terminal feel even more suffocating. His black suit was a masterpiece of silent wealth, the fabric catching the sickly yellow light of the overhead fluorescence and refusing to reflect it. His white dress shirt was crisp enough to cut, and the top button was undone, revealing the starting point of a dragon's tail that curled with lethal elegance up his neck. The ink was dark, ancient, and intricate, vanishing into the shadows beneath his jawline like a secret that only the brave or the foolish dared to uncover. Beside her, Ashley's sobbing had hitch-stepped into a series of shallow, rhythmic gasps. The little girl, usually hyper-aware of any man in their proximity, had gone remarkably quiet, her glossy eyes fixed on the silver luxury watch that gleamed on Kang-jun's wrist. It was a heavy, mechanical piece, the rhythmic ticking of its internal gears the only sound in the small vacuum of power they now occupied. Kang-jun did not look at the child with the soft, performative pity of a stranger, instead, he turned his head with a slow, predatory grace and fixed Kate with a clinical gaze. It was a look that didn't just see her, it dissected her. He wasn't looking at the messy strands of her dark hair or the worn fabric of her beige top, his eyes were focused on the dark purple bloom across her cheekbone and the way her fingers were white-knuckled around the handle of her handbag. He was assessing her injuries the way a general assesses a battlefield, or perhaps the way a master craftsman looks at a piece of shattered porcelain, calculating the exact force required to break it, and the exact cost to fix it. Kate tried to shrink away, her shoulders hunching forward in a reflexive, protective arc that sought to shield Ashley from this new, cold pressure. She was a runaway, an orphan who had been told her entire life that she was a speck, a ghost, a person whose disappearance would be noted by no one. But as Kang-jun's eyes locked onto hers, she felt the invisible feeling start to dissolve. For the first time in years, she wasn't being looked through, she was being seen with a terrifying, focused intensity. This man wasn't a petty bully like the one she had fled. He didn't need to shout to take up space, he owned the space simply by existing within it. The silence he projected was not an absence of noise, but a presence of its own, a heavy, atmospheric weight that made the commuters on the other side of the terminal look like cardboard cutouts. "You're waiting for a bus that isn't coming," Kang-jun said. His voice was a low, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the plastic bench and into Kate's very bones. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who controlled the schedules of the world. Kate's breath hitched, her lips slightly parted as she struggled to find her voice. I have a ticket," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing that threatened to break under the cold weight of his attention. She clutched her handbag even tighter, her knuckles turning a ghostly, translucent white. Kang-jun didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, his athletic frame unfolding with a grace that made the cramped waiting area feel even smaller. He didn't move to touch her, but the proximity was a threat in itself, a vacuum of power that pulled her toward him. He looked at the tattered teddy bear in Ashley's arms, then back to the swelling on Kate's face. "The man you are running from is not a wolf," he remarked, his tone devoid of emotion, yet carrying a jagged edge of disdain. "He is a scavenger. And scavengers only hunt what they believe has been abandoned." The statement hit Kate like a physical blow, a direct strike to the orphan complex that had been her cage for 6 years. She looked at his hands, resting calmly on his knees. They were large, powerful hands, also bearing dark ink designs that suggested a history written in violence and discipline. She realized then that she was caught between two fires, the chaotic, burning rage of the man she had left, and the cold, unyielding ice of the man who had just found her. Kang-jun didn't offer a hand of comfort or a soft word of reassurance. He offered a stillness that was far more terrifying because it demanded something of her. He was watching her to see if the hollow shell he saw had enough iron left in it to survive the night. Outside, the Chicago storm reached a crescendo, the rain turning into a torrential downpour that blurred the world beyond the glass. The terminal felt like a sinking ship, and the man in the black suit was the only thing that appeared solid. Kate looked at his luxury silver watch again, the second hand sweeping with a relentless, mechanical precision. She felt her hypervigilance screaming at her to run, to get as far away from the dragon ink and the cedarwood scent as possible. But her legs felt like lead, pinned by the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. She was an exhausted mother, a bruised survivor, and a lost soul, but in the reflection of Seo Kang-jun's focused, unreadable eyes, she saw the first spark of something she hadn't felt in a decade, the realization that being a ghost meant she was untraceable, and being nothing meant she was free to become anything. Kang-jun turned his gaze back toward the terminal doors, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. He occupied the space with a quiet dominance that made the air feel electrified. He wasn't waiting for a bus, he was waiting for the world to catch up to his will. And as Kate huddled close to her tearful daughter, she understood that the terminal of lost souls had just become a threshold. The invisible feeling was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty that she had been claimed by a power that didn't believe in ghosts. The storm was outside, but the true cold was sitting right beside her, and for the first time, Kate Smith didn't know which one she feared more. The hiss of the pneumatic doors was sharper this time, a jagged sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the terminal like a blade through silk. Kate Smith didn't need to look up to know that the atmosphere had curdled. The air, already heavy with the scent of Seo Kang-jun's expensive cedar and the metallic tang of the storm, suddenly took on a sour, familiar heat. It was the smell of unwashed desperation and the sharp, cheap sting of domestic rage. Beside her, Ashley's small body went rigid, her fingers knotting into the matted fur of her teddy bear with such force that the loose button eye finally popped, skittering across the linoleum floor like a discarded thought. Kate's breath hitched, her lungs suddenly feeling as though they were filled with crushed glass. She didn't look at the door, she looked at the reflection in the darkened terminal window, and there he was, a silhouette of jagged edges and chaotic intent, framed by the aggressive glare of the platform lights. Jerry Hudson didn't walk into the terminal, he invaded it. He was a man built of small, sharp cruelties, his face contorted into a mask of triumph that turned his features into something reptilian. He stood at the threshold for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of a predator at a watering hole. When his gaze landed on the beige top and the pink hoodie, his smile widened, a slow, ugly baring of teeth that made Kate feel as though her skin were being flayed. He began to stride toward them, his heavy, salt-stained boots thudding against the floor with a rhythmic arrogance that signaled he believed the chase was over. For 6 years, that sound had been the herald of Kate's pain, the percussion of her private war. She felt the orphan complex Jerry had spent half a decade building, the terrifying certainty that she was a ghost with no one to call, clamping down on her throat, stealing her air, turning her limbs to lead. "Katie," Jerry called out, his voice a rasping, nicotine-stained weapon that cut through the silence of the other passengers. "Did you really think you could just walk out? After everything I've done for you? You're an orphan, Kate. You've got nobody. You're coming home right now, or I swear to God, you'll wish you never drew breath." Kate tried to stand, her slim, petite frame swaying as her survival energy began to fracture. Her large, expressive eyes were wide, tracking Jerry's approach with a hypervigilance that was now useless. She looked at the exit, then at the empty ticket counter, then back at the man who had broken her. The ordinary commuters shifted in their seats, their eyes darting away, their silence. A wall that Jerry used to hem her in. He was 10 feet away, his hand already reaching out, fingers curled into claws meant to wrap around her bruised arm and drag her back into the cage. But Jerry didn't reach her. The air in the terminal didn't just shift, it froze. Seo Kang-jun rose from the plastic bench. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. His tall, athletic frame unfolded with a predatory grace that made the cavernous terminal feel suddenly, claustrophobically small. He stepped into the aisle, placing himself directly between the scavenger and the prey. He didn't raise his hands or adopt a fighting stance, he simply stood there, one hand casually resting near the lapel of his black tailored suit, his thumb brushing the silver luxury watch that marked the end of Jerry's time. The dragon ink on his neck seemed to pulse in the flickering fluorescent light, a dark, ancient warning that Jerry was too blinded by rage to read. Jerry skidded to a halt, his bravado hitting a wall of absolute, freezing ice. He looked up at Kang-jun, his eyes traveling from the expensive shoes to the sharp, unreadable East Asian features, and for the first time in 6 years, the power dynamic in the room inverted. Jerry tried to puff out his chest, but against Kang-jun's relaxed, dominant posture, he looked small, weak, and pathetic, a child playing at being a monster in the presence of a god. "Move, pal," Jerry spat, though the venom in his voice was now thinned by a sudden, jagged streak of uncertainty. "That's my wife. She belongs to me. She's got no family, no one to speak for her. You're interfering in a private matter." Kang-jun didn't move an inch. He tilted his head slightly, the clinical gaze he had applied to Kate now fixed on Jerry. It was the look a man gives an insect he is deciding whether to crush or simply ignore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold lighter, the metallic clink echoing like a gunshot in the hushed terminal. He didn't light a cigarette, he just toyed with the flame, his eyes never leaving Jerry's. Men who believe they own people are usually the ones who own nothing of value themselves, Kang-jun remarked. His voice was a low, melodic hum, but it carried a weight that made the floor seem to tremble. "You see a woman with no family. I see a woman who has spent the last hour proving she has more iron in her blood than you will ever have in your entire, miserable life. She's nothing." Jerry barked, his voice rising into a frantic, high-pitched register. "She's a ghost. No one is coming for her." Kang-jun took a single, slow step forward. It wasn't an aggressive movement, but the sheer gravity of his dangerous energy forced Jerry to take an involuntary step back, his boots slipping on the damp floor. The Mafia Boss leaned in, the scent of expensive cedar and cold ozone washing over the smaller man, a silent promise of a violence Jerry couldn't even fathom. "You are mistaken," Kang-jun whispered, the smoothness of his tone more terrifying than any scream. "She is standing beside me now. And in this city, that means she is no longer alone. It means that if you take one more step toward her, I will ensure you never take another step in this life again. I find I have a very low tolerance for scavengers who touch things that don't belong to them." Jerry looked at the dragon tattoos on Kang-jun's hands, then at the absolute, lethal lack of fear in the man's flint-colored eyes. He looked at the shadows behind Kang-jun, which seemed to be moving, as if the very darkness of the terminal answered to the man in the black suit. The realization hit Jerry like a physical blow. He wasn't dealing with a good Samaritan. He was dealing with a power that could erase his existence from the world's ledgers in a heartbeat. The frantic triumph in Jerry's eyes died, replaced by a raw, hollow terror. Without another word, he turned, his heavy boots no longer thudding with arrogance but scurrying with the frantic rhythm of a beaten dog. He fled through the pneumatic doors and out into the Chicago rain, his silhouette disappearing into the dark. The silence that followed was absolute. The other passengers didn't move. Kate stood shivering, her slim frame swaying as the adrenaline that had been her only fuel began to crack. She looked at the man who had just dismantled her nightmare with a few whispered words, her large, glossy eyes filled with a new, terrifying uncertainty. She had traded a petty bully for a dragon, and she didn't know the price of her protection. Kang-jun didn't turn to her immediately. He adjusted his cuff, his movements precise and disciplined. Then, he looked down at Kate and the girl in the pink hoodie. He didn't offer a smile, he offered a reality. He gestured toward the doors, where a sleek black sedan had just pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a great beast. "If you stay here, you are waiting for a ghost," Kang-jun said, his voice returning to that calm, unreadable hum. "But if you come with me, you stop being a prey. You are under the shadow of the den now, Kate Smith. Choose." Kate looked at Ashley, who had finally stopped crying and was staring at the man who had made the scary man run away. She looked at her own bruised reflection in the glass one last time, seeing the hollow shell start to fill with a cold, desperate resolve. She took her daughter's hand, her grip steady for the first time in years. They weren't invisible anymore. They were claimed. As they walked toward the car, leaving the terminal of lost souls behind, Kate realized she wasn't just escaping a marriage, she was entering an empire. The storm was still raging, but for the first time, she wasn't the one being hunted. She was walking beside the man who owned the dark. The transition from the rain-lashed terminal to the interior of the black sedan was like stepping from a riot into a tomb. The car was a masterpiece of insulated silence, the heavy thud of the door sealing out the roar of the Chicago storm and the frantic, echoing memory of Jerry's voice. Inside, the air was conditioned to a perfect, sterile coolness, carrying the familiar scent of expensive cedarwood and something deeper, the smell of brand-new leather and high-end electronics. Kate sat in the back, her slim, petite frame practically swallowed by the deep shadows of the seat, while Ashley sat pressed against her side, still clutching the teddy bear with a white-knuckled grip. Beside them, Seo Kang-jun remained a statue of cool indifference, his profile illuminated fitfully by the passing neon blur of the city. He didn't look at her, nor did he offer a word of comfort. He simply sat with his hands resting on his knees, his dragon tattoos intermittently catching the light of street lamps like a warning flare. Kate watched the world outside the tinted windows, a blur of gray concrete and yellow light, and realized with a jolt of vertigo that the city she thought she knew was disappearing, replaced by a darker, more disciplined version of reality. The car didn't stop at a residential street or a hidden safe house. Instead, it slowed before the base of a soaring glass monolith that seemed to pierce the very heart of the storm clouds. This was a structure of steel and transparency, a needle of light in the Chicago skyline that radiated a sense of absolute, unshakable authority. As the sedan pulled into a private, subterranean garage, Kate saw men in sharp, dark suits moving with military precision, their eyes scanning the perimeter with a focus that made Jerry's hypervigilance look like child's play. These weren't street thugs, they were soldiers in a silent war. Kang-jun stepped out of the car, and for a moment, Kate hesitated, her hand frozen on the door handle. She was an orphan who had spent 5 years being told she was nothing, and now she was standing at the threshold of a dragon's den. But when she looked at Ashley's wide, glossy eyes, she knew there was no going back. She stepped out into the climate-controlled air of the garage, following the man in the black suit toward a private elevator that felt less like a lift and more like a pressurized chamber. The doors slid open at the summit of the building, and Kate's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a sanctuary, perhaps a lavish apartment filled with the trappings of a criminal's wealth, but the penthouse was something far more intimidating. It was a sprawling expanse of charcoal-colored furniture, polished concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the city as if it were a game board laid out for inspection. The space was cavernous and surgically clean, illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that threw long, dramatic shadows across the floor. But it wasn't the luxury that made Kate's heart hammer against her ribs, it was the atmosphere of the room. This was not a home, it was a command center. To her left, a wall of monitors flickered with silent data, security feeds, stock tickers, and encrypted maps of the city's industrial districts. Men stood in the shadows of the hallways, quiet, alert figures with the same focused, lethal eyes as Kang-jun. This was the nerve center of an empire, a place where whispers changed the fate of millions, and Kate felt like a speck of dust that had accidentally wandered into the gears of a great, grinding machine. "This isn't a house," Kate whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the vast, silent space. She stood frozen in the foyer, her wet sneakers leaving damp, apologetic prints on the pristine concrete. She felt exposed, her bruised face and messy dark hair a jarring imperfection in a world that demanded total symmetry. Kang-jun shed his tailored suit jacket, handing it to a subordinate who appeared from the shadows like a ghost. He stood in his white dress shirt, the top buttons open to reveal the dark ink of the dragon snaking toward his collarbone. He walked toward a bar made of raw, unpolished stone and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't look back at her as he spoke, his voice a low, melodic hum that carried easily across the room. "It is the seat of governance," he replied, his tone as cold and precise as the architecture surrounding them. "You wanted to run from a man who used your isolation to break you. To do that, Kate, you had to enter a world where isolation is a luxury we cannot afford. Here, every shadow is accounted for. Every breath is a matter of record." He turned then, his flint-colored eyes fixing her with that clinical gaze that seemed to peel away her skin. He offered her a glass, his posture relaxed but commanding. Kate took it with trembling fingers, the cold crystal biting into her palm. She looked at his hands and saw the history of violence written in the intricate tattoos on his knuckles, designs that spoke of a life lived in the heart of the Korean Mafia. She realized then that she hadn't just escaped a toxic marriage, she had been pulled into the eye of a hurricane. Jerry had always told her she was nothing because she had no family, but as she looked at the soldiers standing guard in the hallways and the high-tech monolith they occupied, she saw a different kind of family. One built on discipline, blood, and the absolute rejection of weakness. It was terrifying, a reality so far removed from her hollow shell existence that it made her head swim, but for the first time in 6 years, the fear wasn't a weight pulling her down, it was a spark of something sharp and potentially lethal. Ashley, sensing the shift in the air, huddled closer to Kate's leg, her soft pink hoodie a bright, strange stain against the charcoal furniture. She looked at the sprawling city. Below, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. For a child who had lived in a world of whispered threats and slammed doors, the sheer scale of the penthouse was overwhelming. Kang-jun noted the child's distress, but he didn't move to comfort her. Instead, he gestured toward a hallway where a woman in a professional, dark uniform stood waiting. "The guest suite is prepared," he said. There are medical supplies for your face and clothes that do not smell of the rain. Sleep, Kate Smith. Tomorrow, the world will still be there, but it will no longer be the one that broke you. As Kate followed the silent attendant toward the guest suite, she felt the weight of the dragon's den pressing in on her. The penthouse was a temple of white stone and soft, artificial light, a place where the chaos of the streets couldn't reach. She entered the suite and found a room that was a silent expanse of high-end finishes and oppressive luxury. A tray of medical supplies and silk pajamas lay on the bed, looking like offerings to a displaced queen. Kate stood in the center of the room, her reflection showing in the dark, polished surface of a dresser. She saw the ghost Jerry had tried to create, the bruised temple, the sunken eyes, the weary posture of a victim. But she also saw the man in the black suit standing in the foyer, a pillar of unnatural stillness who had looked at her and seen a project rather than a target. She realized then that the orphan complex wasn't just a cage, it was a lack of vision. Jerry had convinced her she was invisible because he wanted to keep her in the dark. But Seo Kang-jun lived in the dark, and to him, being a ghost was an advantage. She touched the split on her lip, the pain now a dull, rhythmic throb. She wasn't just a runaway anymore, she was a guest of the most dangerous man in Chicago, housed in a fortress of iron and ink. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a new energy was beginning to stir, a survival energy that Jerry had never been able to fully extinguish. She wasn't a ghost anymore, she was a storm in the making, and as the climate control hummed a low, mechanical lullaby, Kate Smith realized that she had finally found a place where the doors stayed locked, not to keep her in, but to keep the rest of the world out. Would she become a soldier in this new empire, or would the weight of the dragon's den eventually crush what was left of her? She didn't know the answer, but as she looked out at the glowing grid of the city, she knew one thing for certain, she was no longer alone in the dark. The guest suite was an expanse of high-end finishes and oppressive luxury, a silent cathedral of charcoal-colored wood and polished stone that seemed to swallow the sound of Kate's ragged breathing. Standing in the center of the room, Kate felt like a structural defect in a masterpiece of modern design. Her damp sneakers left dark, apologetic prints on the pristine rug, and the scent of the Chicago rain clung to her beige top like a shroud. To her left, Ashley had already climbed onto the massive, silk-sheeted bed, her small frame looking impossibly fragile against the scale of the room. The girl was still clutching the one-eyed teddy bear, but her glossy eyes were drifting shut, the sheer exhaustion of their flight finally overriding the hypervigilance of the terminal. Kate watched her for a moment, a sharp pang of protective love cutting through her own fatigue, before she turned toward the bathroom, a temple of white marble and soft, recessed light that promised a different kind of sanctuary. When the heavy stone door clicked shut, the silence became absolute, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the penthouse's climate control. Kate stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror and, for a long, agonizing minute, she couldn't bring herself to look. In her mind, she was still the hollow shell Jerry had spent 5 years hollowing out, a ghost, a speck, a non-person whose only value was as a target for his jagged rage. But the reflection that finally met her gaze was a map of survival she had never dared to read. Her oval face was pale, nearly translucent under the clinical white lights, and the dark purple bruise blooming across her temple was a visceral reminder of the orphan complex she was trying to shed. The swelling on her cheek made her large, expressive eyes look sunken and haunted, wide with a lingering terror that the stone walls couldn't quite keep out. "You have nobody, Kate." Jerry's voice echoed in the stillness, a phantom vibration in the back of her skull. He had spent half a decade making her believe her lack of family made her invisible to the world's mercy. But as she stared at the split in her lip and the messy strands of her dark hair, she saw a flicker of something else, a quiet, stubborn energy that Jerry's ring had failed to extinguish. She reached for the tray of medical supplies the attendant had left. The bottles were unlabeled but smelled of high-grade antiseptics and expensive botanicals. With a hand that still shook, she began to clean her wounds. The sting of the alcohol was sharp, a localized fire that grounded her in the present, pulling her away from the memory of the rain and the terminal. Each dab of the cotton swab felt like a tactical erasure, a clinical focus that mimicked the way Seo Kang-jun had looked at her on the subway bench. She wasn't just tending to injuries, she was beginning a systematic deconstruction of the woman who had run. She shed her survival clothes with a sense of profound, heavy relief. The beige top and the denim jeans, damp and gritty with the grime of the city, fell to the marble floor in a heap, a discarded skin that no longer fit the person she was becoming. She stepped into the shower, the water hitting her skin in a torrential, temperature-controlled downpour that felt like it could wash away the very memory of Jerry's touch. She stood there until the steam filled the room, a white fog that obscured the high-end finishes and left her alone with the rhythmic drumming of the water. When she finally stepped out, she reached for the silk pajamas laid out on the counter. The fabric was a deep, midnight blue, so smooth it felt like liquid against her skin. It was the antithesis of the worn, practical garments she had worn for years as armor. Sliding into the silk was her first act of true governance, a signal to her own nervous system that the war of the streets had been traded for the discipline of the den. Kate returned to the main room, her movements fluid and quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed, her damp hair clinging to the silk collar, and looked at the door. Beyond that would lay a command center governed by a man with dragon ink on his neck and a flint-colored gaze that saw through the illusions of the weak. Jerry had told her she was nothing because she had no family to call, but in this penthouse, isolation was being rebranded as a fortress. She realized then that being an orphan didn't mean she was a ghost, it meant she was a blank ledger, a woman who could be rewritten by the power that now surrounded her. She wasn't a runaway anymore, she was a guest of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and the invisible feeling was being replaced by a sharp, flickering curiosity about the man in the black suit. She thought of Kang-jun sitting at his obsidian desk, tracking the movements of the city as if he were a god watching a game of chess. He didn't offer her the soft, performative pity she had seen in the eyes of the commuters. He offered her a seat of governance. He had seen her bruises not as a sign of defeat, but as a puzzle to be assessed. Jerry had used her silence against her, but Kang-jun used his own silence as a weapon. As she watched Ashley breathe in the deep, rhythmic sleep of the finally safe, Kate felt the hollow shell within her beginning to fill with a cold, desperate resolve. She wasn't going to be the woman in the red sweater anymore, the one who made herself small to avoid the blow. She was going to learn the architecture of the dragon. The next morning, the penthouse was filled with a sharp, clinical gray light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the city grid below like a circuit board. Kate emerged from the suite, her slim frame feeling fragile but steady in the silk. She found Kang-jun standing by the window, his athletic frame silhouetted against the morning storm. He wasn't training with the uncontrolled violence Jerry used, he was simply standing, a pillar of unnatural stillness, watching the world he governed. He turned as she approached, his focused eyes tracking the way she held her shoulders, higher now, no longer hunched in a defensive arc. He didn't comment on her appearance, but the slight narrowing of his eyes told her he noticed the change. The survival energy was no longer a frantic hum, it was a low, resonant frequency. The first lesson of the den is simple, Kate, Kang-jun said, his voice a melodic hum that carried across the cavernous room. The world believes you are a ghost because you have no one to speak for you. They think you are a speck. But a speck is untraceable. A ghost cannot be struck. Your isolation is not your cage, it is the wall we build to keep the rest of the world out. Kate stood her ground, her large brown eyes meeting his flint-colored stare. She didn't look away, and she didn't apologize for the space she occupied. She felt the silk against her skin and the iron in her blood. She was an orphan, a runaway, and a mother, but as the shadows of the penthouse lengthened, she realized she was also something else. She was the project of a man who didn't believe in accidents. The orphan complex was breaking, and in its place, a new foundation was being laid, one of silk, stone, and the absolute certainty that the dragon did not protect things that were truly nothing. She was a storm in the making, and as the morning light hit the dragon ink on Kang-jun's neck, Kate Smith understood that she had finally stopped running and started to haunt the city that had once tried to erase her. The internal shift was complete, the war had just begun. The clinical gray light of a Chicago morning didn't so much enter the penthouse as it was permitted to exist within it, illuminating the charcoal-colored furniture and the surgically clean surfaces of the dragon's den. Kate stood at the edge of the sprawling living area, her silk pajamas replaced by a soft blue sweater and dark trousers that felt like a secondary skin. The swelling on her face had begun to subside, leaving behind a faint, greenish-yellow ghost of Jerry's last lesson, but her eyes remained wide, still vibrating with the hypervigilance of a woman who expected a blow from every shadow. Across the room, Seo Kang-jun stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his athletic frame silhouetted against the storm clouds that still paced the horizon. He wasn't moving, yet he occupied the space with an intensity that made the air feel pressurized, a vacuum of power that pulled at Kate's very center. He didn't turn to greet her. He simply waited until her footsteps faltered and stopped, the silence between them a living thing that demanded to be respected. "You are still walking like someone who is waiting for permission to exist, Kate," Kang-jun said, his voice a low, melodic hum that carried across the cavernous room without effort. He turned slowly, his flint-colored eyes tracking the way she held her handbag, clutched against her chest like a shield, her shoulders hunched in a defensive, telltale arc. "Jerry used your body to tell a story of defeat. He wrote his name in your bruises and taught your muscles the language of the victim. But in this city, if you look like prey, the world will eventually become the predator." He gestured for her to come closer, moving with a predatory grace that made his black sleeveless shirt look like a part of his own skin, the dragon ink on his arms pulsing with every shift of his weight. Kate approached, her breath hitching as she entered the scent of cedarwood and cold metal that followed him. He didn't reach out to touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a controlled energy that forced her to look up. "Governance begins with the skeleton," he whispered, his focused eyes locking onto hers. "Pull your shoulders back." Not with the tension of a soldier, but with the ease of a woman who knows that the floor beneath her feet belongs to her. "Your spine is the pillar of your empire. If it bends, the whole structure falls." Kate tried to adjust, her movements jerky and self-conscious. She had spent 5 years trying to be as small as possible, a speck that Jerry could ignore when he was bored. To stand tall felt like an invitation to violence, a dangerous exposure that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. But Kang-jun's gaze was unyielding, a clinical, unblinking pressure that wouldn't allow her to shrink. He walked a slow circle around her, his footsteps silent on the polished concrete. "Your chin is too low," he noted, his tone devoid of pity. "When you look at the floor, you are telling the enemy where you expect to end up. Look through the world, Kate. Not at it. Look at the horizon as if you are the one who decided where it should sit." For the next hour, the penthouse became a laboratory of stillness. Kang-jun didn't teach her how to throw a punch or how to handle a weapon, he taught her the language of silence. He made her walk the length of the glass wall again and again, correcting the rhythm of her stride until the frantic, scurrying energy of the runaway was replaced by a fluid, disciplined grace. He taught her the mask, the art of keeping the face as unreadable as a sheet of obsidian. "The enemy hunts for the flicker in your eyes," he explained, standing so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "They want to see the fear because fear is the handle they use to turn you. If you give them nothing, they have nothing to grasp. Your face is not a window, it is a wall of high-end finishes. It denies them the satisfaction of knowing they have hurt you." Kate practiced the mask in the reflection of the glass, watching her own oval face transform. She worked to steady the slight parting of her lips and the frantic darting of her large brown eyes. She thought of Jerry's jagged rage and how he had thrived on her tears, using them as fuel for his own pathetic sense of power. As she tightened the muscles around her jaw and stilled her expression, she felt a strange, cold iron beginning to settle in her blood. She wasn't just hiding her fear, she was starving it. By refusing to let the terror show, she was reclaiming the energy it usually consumed. She looked at Kang-jun, her posture now settled, her shoulders level, her gaze meeting his flinty stare without flickering. "Better," he murmured, a subtle softening in his expression that was the closest he came to a compliment. He reached for a cigarette but didn't light it, merely rolling it between his fingers with a mechanical precision. Jerry taught you that being an orphan made you a ghost no one would look for. He used your isolation as a cage. But look at this city below us. He gestured toward the sprawling grid of Chicago, a million lights flickering under the gray morning sky. It is filled with people who spend their lives performing for an audience that doesn't care. They are slaves to their own visibility. But you have no strings left. You have no one to answer to but the man in this room. That makes you a ghost that cannot be struck. That makes you dangerous. The realization hit Kate with the force of a physical blow, but this time, there was no bruise. She saw the dragon tattoos on his wrists and realized that his power wasn't born of loud violence, but of this same surgical, calculated distance. He was a man who had built a monolith out of his own isolation. She felt the orphan complex Jerry had spent years cultivating finally starting to crack under the weight of this new philosophy. She wasn't a hollow shell because she was alone, she was a vessel being filled with the discipline of the dragon. She practiced the mask once more, looking at the city not as a place to hide, but as a territory to be governed. "Why are you doing this, Jima?" she asked, using the name she had heard the soldiers whisper in the hallways. Her voice was steady, a resonant hum that carried the first notes of her new authority. "Why go to this length for someone who has nothing to offer you?" Kang-jun turned back to the window, his profile as sharp and unforgiving as the glass itself. "Being an orphan is not a lack of value, Kate," he said, his voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register. "It is a specific kind of shield. I protect you because I know how heavy the foundation feels when you have to build it yourself, brick by brick, out of the rubble of people who tried to break you. I didn't always own the shadows. I was once a speck, too. And I learned that the only way to stop a monster is to become something they cannot even name." Kate stood beside him, her blue sweater a soft contrast to the iron and stone of the penthouse. She didn't crowd him, but she didn't shrink away either. She felt the silk of her internal shift settling into a permanent foundation. She wasn't the woman in the red sweater anymore, clutching a handbag on a subway bench and praying to be invisible. She was a woman learning that presence is the ultimate form of protection. As the sun finally managed to pierce the Chicago clouds, casting a long, golden spear across the polished concrete, Kate Smith realized that the language of silence was the first true thing she had ever spoken. She was no longer a victim waiting for the storm to pass, she was learning how to become the storm itself. The lesson was over, but the governance had just begun, and somewhere in the city below, Jerry Hudson had no idea that the ghost he had tried to bury was finally starting to haunt him. The high-altitude silence of the penthouse was not the empty, hollow quiet of the terminal, it was a pressurized, living thing, maintained by the constant hum of the climate control and the disciplined footfalls of men who moved like shadows. For Ashley, who had spent most of her 7 years learning to interpret the violent percussion of slamming doors and raised voices, this new world was a bewildering cathedral of stillness. She sat in the center of the sprawling living area, her small frame swallowed by the charcoal-colored depths of a designer sofa that cost more than her mother's previous 3 years of rent. In her lap, the lopsided teddy bear, now missing its second button eye, sat as a silent witness to her uncertainty. The pink hoodie she wore was a startling, vibrant puncture in the room's monochromatic perfection, a reminder of the soft, fragile life that had been pulled into the heart of an iron empire. She wasn't crying anymore, but her eyes remained wide and glossy, tracking the movement of the sunlight across the polished concrete with a hypervigilance that even the silk sheets of the guest suite couldn't fully soothe. Kate stood in the kitchen alcove, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching her daughter from a distance. She was practicing the governance Kang-jun had taught her, keeping her shoulders level and her spine a straight, unyielding pillar. But seeing Ashley so small against the backdrop of the city grid made the mask difficult to maintain. The girl looked like a stray bird that had flown into a high-tech laboratory, terrified of the very glass that protected her. It was in this moment of quiet observation that the air in the room shifted, taking on that familiar, cold pressure that signaled the arrival of the master of the den. Seo Kang-jun emerged from his office, his black dress shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the intricate dragon ink that seemed to dance under the recessed lights. He didn't head for the bar or the wall of monitors. Instead, his flint-colored gaze landed on the child on the sofa. Kate held her breath, her pulse thrumming in her teeth. She expected him to ignore the girl, to treat her as an extension of the project he was building in Kate. But Kang-jun didn't look away. He walked toward the sofa with a slow, rhythmic grace that lacked even a hint of the frantic energy that usually preceded an adult's approach in Ashley's world. He didn't loom over her, he stopped 3 feet away, his athletic frame silhouetted against the soaring glass windows. He looked at Ashley, and then he looked at the eyeless teddy bear. The silence stretched, a clinical, unblinking tension that Ashley met with a frozen, wide-eyed stare. Then, with a mechanical precision that felt oddly gentle, Kang-jun reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a silver cufflink, engraved with a delicate, geometric pattern. He didn't hand it to her, he placed it on the marble coffee table between them, the metal clicking against the stone with a resonant, clear sound. "The bear has lost his sight," Kang-jun remarked, his voice a low, melodic hum that lacked any of the performative sweetness strangers usually used with children. He spoke to her as if she were a peer, a fellow inhabitant of a dangerous world. A guardian who cannot see is a liability to the Denver. "We should fix it." Ashley blinked, her small fingers twitching against the bear's matted fur. She looked at the silver cufflink, then up at the man with the dragon on his neck. In her experience, men only took things away, toys, peace, her mother's smiles. They didn't offer pieces of their own armor to repair a broken thing. Slowly, as if testing the gravity of the room, she reached out and touched the cool silver. "He's tired," she whispered, her voice a thin, fragile thread. "Jerry said he was trash. He said I should throw him in the rain." Kang-jun's jaw tightened, a subtle shift in his unreadable mask that only Kate, watching from the shadows, could detect. He sat down on the edge of the low table, violating the rules of high-status distance he had just taught Kate, and bridged the gap between the mafia and the child. "Trash is a word used by men who do not understand the value of a survivor," he said, his focused eyes locking onto Ashley's. "This bear has been through a war. He has scars, just like this building. In this city, we do not throw away things that have endured. We reinforce them." He took the bear from her hands, a gesture that would have made Kate scream an hour ago, and inspected it with the same clinical intensity he used to track rival syndicates. He pulled a small, silver sewing kit from a hidden compartment in the side table, a tool of a man who demanded perfection in every stitch of his life, and began to thread a needle. Kate watched, mesmerized, as the most dangerous man in Chicago began to sew a high-end silver cufflink onto the face of a tattered teddy bear. His hands, bearing the dark ink of a lifetime of violence, moved with a surgical, disciplined grace. He didn't fumble or rush. He treated the repair of the bear with the same governance he applied to his empire. As the needle flashed in the gray light, Ashley began to lean forward, her protective arc softening. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking, she was curious. She watched the way Kang-jun's fingers worked, the way he didn't raise his voice or make sudden movements. She was learning a new language, not the language of silence he was teaching Kate, but a language of stability. This penthouse, with its soaring glass and its quiet soldiers, wasn't just a fortress. To Ashley, it was becoming the first place where the floor didn't shake when someone walked across it. The invisible feeling that had haunted her childhood was being replaced by the weight of being protected by something absolute. When he finished, Kang-jun handed the bear back. The silver cufflink gleamed in the center of the toy's face, a bizarre, expensive eye that gave the bear a look of regal, stoic defiance. "There," Kang-jun murmured. "Now he sees like a dragon. He will watch the door while you sleep, and he will tell the shadows that you are no longer a guest. You are part of the foundation." Ashley took the bear and hugged it to her chest, but this time, her grip wasn't desperate. It was possessive. She looked at Kang-jun, and for the first time, a small, tentative spark of a smile touched her lips, a ghost of a feeling she hadn't felt since before she could remember. She didn't say thank you, she didn't have the words for the seismic shift that had just occurred in her soul. She simply sat back, her shoulders level, unconsciously mimicking the posture Kang-jun had corrected in her mother. Kang-jun rose, the mask sliding back into place as if it had never left. He checked his luxury silver watch, the second hand sweeping with relentless precision. He turned to Kate, his flint-colored eyes meeting hers across the room. She is learning the architecture of safety faster than you are, Kate, he noted, his voice returning to its melodic, cold hum. Children understand the value of a fortress. They know that a home is not defined by love, but by the strength of the walls that keep the monsters out. Kate looked at her daughter, who was now quietly talking to her, dragon-eyed, bear, and felt a heavy, resonant peace settle in her chest. The orphan complex was a memory, a thin, paper-thin cage that had been shredded by a silver needle and a man who owned the dark. She realized then that Kang-jun hadn't just given them a room, he had given them a narrative. He was the guardian of the den, and by fixing a child's toy, he had signaled to the entire building, and to the city below, that the specks were now part of his empire. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the concrete, Kate Smith understood that the den was the first real home they had ever known, not because it was comfortable, but because it was unyielding. The soft moment was over, but the foundation was set, and somewhere in the industrial district, the scavengers were beginning to realize that the prey they were hunting now had eyes made of silver and a protector made of stone. The atmosphere within the glass monolith did not shatter all at once, it curdled, a slow-motion transition from the sterile silence of a sanctuary to the pressurized hum of a war room. Outside, the Chicago skyline was a blurred tapestry of weeping charcoal and jagged neon, the storm reaching a crescendo that seemed to vibrate against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, the recessed lights dimmed to a tactical amber, casting long, predatory shadows across the polished concrete. Seo Kang-jun stood at the center of the penthouse, his black dress shirt unbuttoned at the cuffs, his hands resting on the edge of the obsidian desk as he tracked a cluster of heat signatures moving upward through the building's service elevator. He didn't look like a man under threat, he looked like a scientist observing a chemical reaction that he had already predicted. The clinical gaze was back, sharper than ever, as he glanced at the wall of monitors flickering with the grainy, high-contrast images of armed men in the basement levels. Kate stood near the kitchen alcove, her fingers instinctively reaching for the soft blue wool of her sweater. Beside her, Ashley sat on the sofa, her dragon-eyed teddy bear clutched to her chest, her small face set in the mask of stillness she had learned from the man with the tattoos. The hypervigilance that had once been a frantic, scattered energy in Kate's chest had settled into something cold and heavy, a survival energy that no longer demanded she run, but that she stand. She watched the elevator display on the wall, the numbers climbing with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. Jerry was down there. She could feel the sour heat of his desperation through the very steel of the building. He had found a key to the world of violence, a rival syndicate willing to use his toxic obsession as a wedge to pierce the dragon's denver. He wasn't coming for love, and he wasn't even coming for revenge, he was coming to reclaim a piece of property he believed defined his existence. The elevator hissed open at the summit, and the vacuum of power in the room was instantly filled with the jarring, uncoordinated noise of the streets. Jerry Hudson stepped out first, flanked by 4 men in tactical gear whose faces were obscured by the shadows of their balaclavas. Jerry looked disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic, jagged triumph that bordered on mania. He had traded everything, his secrets, his safety, his very soul, for this one moment of reclamation. He scanned the cavernous room until his eyes landed on Kate. He saw the soft blue sweater, the healed lip, and the way she stood with her shoulders level and her chin held high. It was a sight that seemed to physically wound him, a rejection of the hollow shell he had spent 5 years perfecting. "Katie," Jerry rasped, his voice a broken, nicotine-stained weapon that sounded small and pathetic against the grandeur of the penthouse. "Look at you, playing dress-up in a killer's house. You think this glass protects you? You're an orphan. You're nothing. I made a deal to bring you back where you belong. Get over here, now. Kate didn't flinch. She didn't move toward him, and she didn't shrink away. She practiced the governance Kang-jun had taught her, her spine a straight, unyielding pillar, her eyes looking through Jerry as if he were a minor atmospheric disturbance. I am home, Jerry, she said, her voice a resonant, steady hum that carried no trace of the speck she used to be. And for the first time, I am not invisible. I am the foundation of this room, and you are just a scavenger who wandered into the light. Jerry's face contorted, a jagged flush of rage rising from his neck. He turned to the armed men behind him, gesturing wildly toward Kate. Take her. That's what I paid you for. Take the girl and the woman. But the men didn't move. They were looking past Jerry, their weapons leveled at the shadows where Kang-jun's soldiers had begun to materialize like ink stains on a white canvas. The air in the room grew heavy with a cold, controlled pressure. Seo Kang-jun stepped out from behind the obsidian desk, his athletic frame unfolding with a grace that made the tactical gear of the intruders look like clumsy toys. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, he didn't need one. He carried the absolute certainty of a man who owned the city's shadows, his dragon tattoos pulsing in the amber light as he walked a slow, deliberate circle toward the center of the foyer. The deal is over, Jerry, Kang-jun remarked, his tone devoid of emotion, yet carrying a jagged edge of disdain that made the air feel electrified. He checked his luxury silver watch, the second hand sweeping with relentless, mechanical precision. I find I have a very low tolerance for people who believe ownership is a matter of loud voices and cheap deals. You brought these men into my home thinking they were your army. You didn't realize they were just curious to see what kind of man would sell his own blood for a cage. The lead gunman of the rival syndicate stepped forward, his eyes darting between Kang-jun and the silent soldiers in the hallways. He saw the discipline of the den, the surgical cleanliness of the defense, and the absolute lack of fear in the Mafia boss's flint-colored eyes. He realized then that Jerry had led them into a slaughterhouse, not a penthouse. With a subtle, jerky motion, the gunman lowered his weapon. We were told this was a private recovery, he muttered, his voice muffled by the mask. We didn't sign up for a war with the dragon. Then leave, Kang-jun whispered, the smoothness of his tone more terrifying than any scream. And take the scavenger with you. If I see any of you on this grid again, I will ensure the world forgets you ever existed. Jerry let out a harsh, jagged sound, a laugh that broke into a sob. He reached out to grab Kate's arm, a final, desperate attempt to assert the only power he had ever known. But he stopped 3 inches away. Kate didn't move her hand to strike him, she simply looked at him with a mask of absolute stillness, a denial of his existence that was more devastating than a blow. In her eyes, he saw the truth, the orphan complex was dead. She wasn't a ghost he could haunt, she was a storm he couldn't survive. The vacuum of power had been tested, and Jerry Hudson was the only thing that had collapsed. Kang-jun's men moved in with military precision, disarming the rival syndicate and dragging a screaming, frantic Jerry toward the service elevator. The sound of his voice faded into a pathetic echo as the doors hissed shut, leaving the penthouse once again in a state of high-altitude silence. Kate stood in the center of the room, her breath steady, her posture unyielding. She looked at Ashley, who had finally lowered her teddy bear, her small face showing the first signs of a real, unburdened peace. The siege of glass was over, but the transformation was just beginning. Kang-jun walked back toward her, his focused eyes tracking the way she held herself. He didn't offer a word of praise, but he reached out and adjusted the collar of her blue sweater, a rare, disciplined gesture of recognition. You didn't look away, Kate, he noted, his voice a melodic hum. The scavenger is gone. Now, we see what you become when the cage is finally broken. Kate looked out at the Chicago skyline, the rain finally beginning to taper off, revealing the glowing, intricate circuit board of the city below. She wasn't a speck anymore, she was a ghost who had found her haunt. The storm was over, and as she stood beside the man who owned the dark, Kate Smith realized that she wasn't just a guest in the Dragon's Denver. She was part of the architecture. The world had tried to erase her, but in the heart of the glass monolith, she had finally found the iron in her blood. The siege had failed, and for the first time in 6 years, the door didn't just stay locked, it stayed hers. The silence that followed the departure of the rival syndicate was not a hollow thing, it was a dense, pressurized vacuum that seemed to draw the very shadows of the penthouse toward the center of the room. Outside, the Chicago storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise, streaked with the cold, electric gold of a rising moon. Inside, the amber tactical lights of the Dragon's Den hummed with a low-frequency power that resonated in Kate's very bones. She stood in the center of the foyer, her feet planted firmly on the polished concrete, her blue sweater a soft but defiant flag in a room made of iron and glass. Beside her, Ashley had climbed down from the sofa, the dragon-eyed teddy bear held loosely at her side. The girl wasn't hiding behind her mother's legs anymore, she was standing with her shoulders level, her small face a mirror of the disciplined stillness she had observed in the man who owned the dark. Kate felt the orphan complex that had been her cage for 6 years, the terrifying, absolute certainty that she was a speck with no one to call, finally dissolving into the atmosphere, replaced by a cold, resonant iron in her blood. Seo Kang-jun did not move to comfort her. He stood by the obsidian desk, his black dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his dragon tattoos pulsing with a dark, ancient energy under the recessed lights. He watched her with that clinical, unblinking gaze, assessing the governance of her posture and the mask of her expression. He was looking for the flicker of the victim, the telltale flinch of the hollow shell he had found at the terminal. But as Kate met his flint-colored eyes, she didn't blink. She didn't look away. She occupied the space with an absolute certainty that the floor beneath her belonged to her, not because it had been given, but because she had claimed it in the heat of the siege. She was no longer a guest in the den, she was part of its architecture, a ghost who had finally found the strength to haunt the world that had tried to erase her. The elevator doors hissed open one final time. It wasn't an intruder this time, but 2 of Kang-jun's senior soldiers, their faces as unreadable as the stone walls they guarded. Between them, they held Jerry Hudson. He was a broken, jagged thing now, his bravado stripped away to reveal the pathetic, scavenger heart beneath. His expensive coat was torn, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, animal terror that suggested he finally understood the scale of the power he had tried to provoke. When they forced him to his knees in the center of the foyer, Jerry looked up at Kate, his mouth working silently as he searched for the words that used to make her shrink. He looked for the speck, the orphan, the woman who had no one. But when his gaze hit Kate's face, he found only a wall of high-end finishes. "Katie," Jerry whispered, his voice a rasping, desperate thread that carried none of its former venom. "Please. You know me. We're family. You have nobody else. Tell this man to let me go. I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just tell him I'm yours." Kate took a single, slow step forward. She didn't rush, and she didn't raise her hands in anger. She moved with the fluid, predatory grace that Kang-jun had corrected into her stride over the last few days. She stopped 3 feet from the man who had spent half a decade trying to hollow her out, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a small, loud man who had used her isolation to build a pedestal for his own weakness. She leaned in slightly, the scent of the den, expensive cedarwood and cold ozone, clinging to her like a secondary skin. When she spoke, her voice wasn't a whisper, it was a resonant, low hum that vibrated through the air with a controlled power that left Jerry's frantic pleas sounding like the buzzing of a fly. "You are mistaken, Jerry," Kate said, her tone devoid of the heat of revenge, replaced by the cold weight of governance. "You spent 6 years telling me I was a ghost because I had no family to speak for me. You thought my silence was a cage. But you didn't realize that a ghost cannot be struck, and a woman with no foundation is free to build one out of iron. I am not yours. I never was. I am the storm you didn't see coming, and in this city, you have no more shadows to hide in." Jerry recoiled as if she had struck him, his face contorting with a sudden, jagged realization. He looked at Seo Kang-jun, who remained a pillar of unnatural stillness in the background, and then back at the woman in the blue sweater. He saw the mask she wore, the absolute denial of his power over her, and he understood that the war was over. He had tried to reclaim a piece of property, only to find that the property had become a sovereign power. He wasn't just losing a wife, he was being erased from her narrative. Kang-jun checked his luxury silver watch, the second hand sweeping with its relentless, mechanical precision. He looked at the soldiers, a subtle, lethal glint in his eyes that signaled the end of the encounter. "The scavenger has no place in the den," he remarked, his voice a melodic, terrifying hum. "Remove him. Ensure the world forgets his name by morning. He is a debt that has been settled in full." As the soldiers dragged a sobbing, broken Jerry toward the service elevator, the sound of his frantic apologies faded into the hum of the climate control. Kate stood her ground until the doors hissed shut, marking the permanent removal of the man who had tried to define her by her wounds. The silence that returned to the penthouse was different now. It was a clean, sharp quiet, a space waiting to be filled by the future. Kate felt a heavy, resonant peace settle in her chest, that survival energy, finally calming into a permanent foundation. She wasn't an orphan anymore, she was a woman who had written her own history in the heart of the dragon's den. Kang-jun walked toward her, his focused eyes tracking the way she held her shoulders. He didn't offer a smile, but he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare, disciplined gesture of recognition that carried the weight of a blood oath. "You spoke with the voice of the city, Kate," he noted, his voice dropping into a lower, more intimate register. "The scavenger is gone, and the ghost has become the storm. You are no longer a project. You are a partner in this governance." Kate looked at Ashley, who was now sitting quietly on the sofa, her dragon-eyed bear watching the door with a stoic, silver stare. The girl looked safe, her small frame no longer vibrating with the hypervigilance of the hunted. Kate turned back to the man with the dragon ink on his neck, her large brown eyes meeting his flint-colored gaze with an unyielding clarity. She wasn't afraid of the dark anymore, she was the one who owned it. The city below was still a vast, grinding grid of millions, but Kate Smith was no longer a speck lost in the machinery. She was a woman who had found a light in the darkest place imaginable, and as the moon rose over the glass monolith, she realized that being lost had been the only way to be found by a power that refused to let her go. The orphan complex was dead. The hollow shell was full of iron. And as the master of the den led her toward the wall of monitors to begin the night's work, Kate Smith understood that her life wasn't just beginning, it was being governed by her own hand. The storm had arrived, and for the first time in 6 years, the air was perfectly, beautifully clear. The morning after the final removal of Jerry Hudson did not bring a celebratory light to the glass monolith, instead, it ushered in a clarity that was as cold and sharp as a diamond's edge. The Chicago skyline was no longer a blurred, weeping charcoal mess but a sprawling, intricate circuit board of silver and steel, laid out beneath a sky that had finally been scoured clean by the storm. Kate Smith stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, her feet planted firmly on the polished concrete, her silhouette a pillar of quiet, unyielding grace. She wore a tailored black suit now, a gift from the den that mirrored the disciplined armor of Seo Kang-jun. Beside her, Ashley sat at the stone breakfast bar, her dragon-eyed teddy bear resting on the counter. The girl was eating in a state of profound, rhythmic peace, her small shoulders level and her gaze steady. The hypervigilance that had once made her look like a trapped bird had been replaced by the governance of a child who knew that the walls around her were made of iron. Kate looked at her reflection in the glass and saw a woman who had finally been rendered in high definition. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a faint, yellowish memory, but the mask she wore was permanent, a clinical, focused stillness that denied the world the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She realized then that the journey from the rain-drenched terminal to the summit of this tower had been more than a physical escape, it had been a systematic deconstruction of the most dangerous lie she had ever been told. Jerry had spent 5 years using her orphan complex as a weapon, convincing her that because she had no family, she was a ghost with no value. He had taught her that isolation was a hole, a dark, bottomless pit where she would eventually disappear, unmourned and unnoticed. But as she stood in the heart of the dragon's den, Kate understood the profound moral of her own transformation. Isolation was not a hole to fall into, but a foundation to build upon. Seo Kang-jun emerged from the shadows of the hallway, his athletic frame moving with that predatory, silent grace that Kate had come to recognize as the ultimate expression of self-possession. He didn't offer a morning greeting, he simply stood beside her, his flint-colored eyes tracking the movement of the city below. He looked at the dragon ink on his own wrists and then at the steady hands of the woman beside him. The air between them was filled with a resonant, melodic hum, the sound of two people who had stopped running and started to govern the dark. "The world fears the orphan, Kate," Kang-jun said, his voice a low, mechanical vibration that seemed to anchor the entire room. "They fear the person with no strings, no history, and no master. Jerry tried to make you fear yourself because he knew that if you ever realized you were a ghost, you would become untraceable. He wanted you to believe that being alone meant being weak. But in this den, we know the truth. Being alone means you are the only one who decides where the walls are built. It means your foundation is not made of the shifting opinions of others, but of the iron you find in your own blood." This was the moral of the dragon, the educational core of the war they had just won. Kate realized that her hollow shell existence had actually been a state of readiness. Because she had no family to shield her, she had been forced to develop a survival energy that was purer and more resilient than anyone who lived in the sunlight could ever understand. Jerry had tried to fill her emptiness with his rage, but Kang-jun had shown her how to fill it with discipline. The lesson was surgical in its precision. Power is not about who can shout the loudest or who can strike the hardest, it is about the absolute certainty of one's own presence. It is about the language of silence that allows a person to stand their ground even when the world is screaming for them to fall. Kate thought of the millions of people in the city below, slaves to their own visibility, constantly seeking the validation of a crowd that didn't care if they lived or died. They were the ones who were truly lost, scattered across the grid in a frantic search for a foundation they didn't have to build themselves. She looked at Ashley and saw the first generation of a new narrative, a child who was learning that a home is not defined by the presence of a father or a mother, but by the strength of the sanctuary one creates for themselves. Isolation was the ultimate freedom, it was the speck becoming the storm. By embracing her status as an orphan, Kate had discarded the weight of expectations and the fear of abandonment. If you have nothing to lose, you have everything to gain, and if you have no one to catch you, you learn to fly. "He called me a speck," Kate whispered, her voice a resonant, steady hum that carried the weight of her new authority. "He thought that because I was small, I could be erased. But a speck is the only thing that can enter the machinery of the world and grind it to a halt. He didn't realize that the man who found me didn't see a victim. He saw a peer." Kang-jun turned to her, a subtle, disciplined glint in his eyes that was the closest he would ever come to an expression of pride. He checked his luxury silver watch, the second hand sweeping with its relentless, mechanical precision. "The scavenger sees a target, Kate. The dragon sees a potential empire. You were never lost, you were simply waiting for a territory that was worthy of your strength. The terminal was not the end of your story, it was the threshold. You walked through the rain and found the dark, and in the dark, you found that you are the one who carries the light." The realization settled into Kate's chest like a heavy, golden coin. She understood now that her trauma was not a scar to be hidden, but a map of the territory she had conquered. The orphan complex had been the final test of her governance. By standing her ground against Jerry, she hadn't just defeated a man, she had defeated a philosophy. She had proven that the invisible are the most powerful inhabitants of the city because they are the only ones who can see the truth behind the glass. She wasn't a guest in the penthouse anymore, she was the architect of her own safety. As the sun climbed higher over Chicago, casting a long, brilliant spear across the polished concrete of the den, Kate Smith realized that the story of the lost girl and the mafia boss was not a fairy tale of rescue. It was a chronicle of reclamation. She hadn't been saved, she had been found by someone who spoke her language, and then she had been given the tools to save herself. The moral was written in the very stone of the monolith: True power is the ability to stand in the center of the storm and remain perfectly, beautifully still. It is the realization that being alone is the first step toward being unshakable. Kate walked over to Ashley and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. The dragon-eyed bear watched them both, a silent guardian in a world that no longer felt like a cage. Kate looked back at Kang-jun, her flint-colored eyes meeting his with an unyielding clarity. The war was over, but the governance was just beginning. They were the ghosts who owned the city, the specks who moved the mountains, and as the morning light hit the dragon ink on Kang-jun's neck, Kate Smith understood that she was finally home, not because she had found a place to hide, but because she had finally found a reason to stand. The moral of the dragon was the last thing she would ever have to learn, and the first thing she would ever teach. The storm had passed, and the foundation was made of iron.